The cabin lights were dimmed, but sleep wasn't coming. Not for most of the passengers, and certainly not for the baby. From the moment the plane leveled off after takeoff, the infant had been crying. Not the occasional fuss, not a sleepy whimper, but a full-throated, red-faced wail that cut through the drone of the engines like a siren. It echoed down the narrow aisle, bouncing off the overhead bins and the stiff fabric of the seats. People shifted in their places. A woman in 22C sighed and pulled her headphones tighter over her ears. A man in 18F glanced at his watch, then at the ceiling, as if praying for patience. Up in first class, the father sat rigid in his wide leather seat, his jaw clenched. He was used to control, used to walking into a room and having people lean in, listen, nod. His name wasn't known to the public, but his company was. He'd built it from a garage idea into something that now touched millions of lives, and with it came wealth that most people only saw in movies. But none of that mattered right now. He held his son close, rocking gently, whispering soft nonsense words into the baby's ear. He'd tried everything: a fresh diaper, warm milk, a favorite toy that squeaked when squeezed. Nothing worked. The baby just screamed harder, tiny fists flailing, eyes squeezed shut like the world had betrayed him. The flight attendant, a woman with kind eyes and tired shoulders, leaned down and offered a sympathetic smile. "First flights are tough," she said quietly. "He'll settle soon." But her tone carried doubt. She'd seen this before. Babies don't care about frequent flyer miles or platinum cards. The father nodded, but inside, he felt something unfamiliar. Helplessness. He was a man who solved problems before breakfast. If a server crashed, he had a team on it in minutes. If a deal stalled, he rewrote the terms by lunch. But here, in this metal tube hurtling through the sky, with his own child sobbing in his arms, he had no leverage, no backup plan. Just the raw, exposed nerve of being a parent who couldn't fix the one thing that mattered most in that moment. Across the cabin, near the back, a teenager watched. He wasn't supposed to be paying attention. He'd been told to keep his head down, stay out of trouble, and get to his destination without causing a scene. He was flying alone for the first time, clutching a duffel bag that held everything he needed for the next 3 days. 2 changes of clothes, a toothbrush, a notebook filled with practice interview answers, and a folded letter from his teacher that said, "You belong here." He'd boarded quietly, eyes scanning the cabin with quiet awe. He'd never been in first class, but he'd seen it in movies. Plush seats, people sipping champagne, calm and untouched by the chaos of the world. Now, watching the rich man struggle with his crying baby, he saw something else. Vulnerability. It surprised him. He'd always imagined people like that as untouchable, like statues behind glass. But this man looked just like his own uncle had the night his little sister ran a high fever, scared, tired, and completely out of options. The teenager had grown up in a neighborhood where lullabies weren't sung. They were hummed over laundry or whispered during power outages. His mother worked nights at a hospital cafeteria, and by the time she got home, she was too exhausted to do much more than collapse into bed. So when his baby sister wouldn't sleep, it was usually him who took over. He'd learned tricks, a certain rhythm in his step, a low hum that matched the sound of the old radiator in their apartment, the way to hold her so she felt wrapped in safety, not restraint. Now, listening to the baby's cries, his body remembered. His shoulders relaxed slightly. His breathing slowed. Without thinking, he began to hum, softly, just under his breath, a tune his grandmother used to sing in her native tongue. It wasn't loud enough for anyone to notice, just a quiet vibration in his chest. But the baby heard it, not right away. The crying continued for another minute, then another. But then, almost imperceptibly, the wails began to hitch. The pauses between screams grew longer. The father, too wrapped up in his own panic, didn't notice at first. But the teenager did. He stopped humming and watched. The baby's eyes fluttered open. Not fully, but enough. They scanned the cabin, unfocused, searching. Then they landed briefly on the back of the seat in front of him, where the teenager's hand rested on the armrest. The baby let out a shuddering breath. The father finally looked up. He caught the teenager's gaze in the reflection of the window. For a second, they just looked at each other, 2 strangers from different worlds connected only by the raw, universal language of a child in distress. The teenager didn't smile. He didn't wave. He just held the man's eyes for a heartbeat, then gave the tiniest nod. Something in the father's chest loosened. He didn't know why. Maybe it was the calm in the boy's face. Maybe it was the quiet certainty in that nod. Or maybe it was just the fact that for the first time in an hour, his son had stopped screaming long enough to take a real breath. He adjusted the baby in his arms, shifting him upright against his shoulder. The infant let out a soft whimper, then went still. Not asleep, just quiet, listening. The cabin exhaled. The woman in 22C took off her headphones. The man in 18F stopped checking his watch. Even the flight attendant paused mid-aisle, her tray of drinks forgotten for a moment. But the peace didn't last. Within minutes, the baby started fussing again. Less intense this time, but building. The father's shoulders tensed. He tried bouncing gently, patting the baby's back, murmuring reassurances. But the calm was slipping away. The cries returned, sharper now, edged with frustration. The teenager watched, his fingers tapping lightly on his knee in a rhythm only he knew. He thought about staying put. He was just a kid in economy. What right did he have to walk up there? People like him weren't expected to offer help to people like that. The unspoken rules of the world were clear. Stay in your lane, don't draw attention, don't make waves. But then he thought of his sister. Of how she'd cling to his shirt when she was scared. Of how silence wasn't always kindness. Sometimes silence was just fear wearing a different mask. He took a breath and stood up. The movement was small, but in the hushed tension of the cabin, it felt huge. Heads turned. The flight attendant straightened, ready to intervene. The father looked up, wary. The teenager walked slowly down the aisle, his worn sneakers quiet on the carpet. He didn't look nervous. He didn't look bold. He just looked sure. When he reached first class, he stopped a few feet away. "I used to calm my little sister like this," he said, voice low but clear. "Can I try?" The father stared at him, really looked at him. The faded hoodie, the careful posture, the calm in his eyes that didn't match his age. There was no expectation in the boy's face, no demand. Just an offer, plain and simple. For a long moment, the father hesitated. Instinct said no. Protocol said no. The invisible walls between their lives said no. But his son let out another cry, thin and desperate, and something in him broke open. He nodded. The teenager stepped closer. He didn't reach for the baby right away. Instead, he crouched slightly so he was at eye level and began to hum again. Not loud, not showy, just a steady, warm sound that seemed to wrap around the space like a blanket. And this time the baby didn't just quiet down. He stopped crying completely. His little body relaxed. His fingers uncurled. He turned his head toward the sound, eyes wide and curious, as if hearing something he'd forgotten he knew. The father held his breath. Around them, the plane kept flying. The world kept turning. But in that small patch of first class, time slowed. Strangers leaned forward in their seats, not to stare, but to witness. The flight attendant stood frozen, tray forgotten. Even the engines seemed to soften their roar. The teenager reached out slowly, giving the baby time to see his hand, to decide. Then gently, he let the infant grasp his index finger. The baby squeezed hard like he was anchoring himself to something real. And then, so softly no one else could hear it, the teenager began to sing. A lullaby in a language most on the plane had never heard, but one that carried the weight of generations, of mothers and brothers and quiet nights in rooms with thin walls. The baby watched him, calm now, safe now, and for the first time since takeoff, the cabin felt like it could breathe. The teenager stayed for only a few minutes, long enough for the baby to drift into a light doze, head resting against his father's chest. Then, without a word, he stood, gave another small nod, and walked back to his seat in the rear of the plane. No one clapped. No one took out a phone. No grand moment was made, but something had changed. The father looked down at his sleeping son, then toward the back of the plane, where the boy had disappeared behind the curtain separating cabins. He didn't know his name, didn't know his story, but he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that he'd just witnessed something rare. Not magic, not miracle, but simple, unguarded humanity. And in a world that often felt divided by wealth, race, and circumstance, that quiet act of reaching across the aisle, literally and otherwise, felt like the most powerful thing he'd ever seen. Outside, the clouds stretched endlessly, white and soft under the afternoon sun. Inside, a baby slept. A teenager stared out the window, and a man who had everything suddenly realized how much he'd been missing. The plane touched down just after sunset, tires kissing the runway with a soft thud that barely disturbed the baby still curled against his father's chest. Outside, the city lights blinked awake like scattered stars. But inside the cabin, most passengers stayed seated, lingering in the quiet aftermath of what had just happened. No one spoke loudly. No one rushed. There was a shared sense that something unusual had passed between them. Something too delicate to name, but too real to ignore. The father waited until the last possible moment before unbuckling. He moved slowly, careful not to wake his son, who slept with the deep, trusting breaths of a child who finally felt safe. As he gathered his things, a designer diaper bag, a folded blanket, a tablet he hadn't touched once during the flight, he kept glancing toward the back of the plane. He didn't know why he felt so compelled to find the boy. Maybe it was gratitude, maybe it was guilt, or maybe it was the unsettling realization that, for the first time in years, someone had solved a problem he couldn't. With nothing but presence and patience, he stepped into the jet bridge, baby still in his arms, and paused. The crowd ahead moved like a slow river toward baggage claim, but he scanned the faces, searching, and then he saw him. Standing alone near a pillar, duffel bag slung over one shoulder, eyes fixed on the arrivals board like he was memorizing it. The boy looked smaller now, less certain. The calm confidence from the plane had softened into something more familiar. The quiet alertness of someone used to navigating spaces where he wasn't expected to belong. The father walked over. Not fast, not hesitant, just steady. When he was a few feet away, the boy turned as if he'd felt the approach. Their eyes met again, and this time there was no curtain between them, no rows of seats, no invisible lines drawn by ticket class. "Thank you," the man said, voice lower than he intended. "Really, I don't know what we would have done." The boy shrugged, but his eyes stayed kind. "Babies just want to feel safe," he said simply. "It's not magic." "No," the man agreed, but it felt like it. A silence settled between them. Not awkward, just full. The kind of quiet that comes after something meaningful has been shared. Around them, people hurried past with rolling suitcases and loud phone calls. But the two of them stood in their own little bubble, grounded by what had happened 30,000 feet above the ground. After a moment, the man asked, "Are you meeting someone?" The boy shook his head. "No, I'm here for an interview tomorrow. At the academy." He said it plainly, without pride or apology. But the man knew which academy he meant. The one with ivy-covered walls and tuition that cost more than most people made in a decade. He'd donated to their scholarship fund once, years ago, more out of tax strategy than belief. Now, hearing this boy say those words so calmly, he felt a flicker of shame. "You're here alone?" he asked. "Yeah. My mom couldn't get time off. She works nights." The boy shifted his bag. "But it's okay. I've got directions. And a bus pass." The man nodded, but something in his chest tightened. He thought of his own son, safe in his arms, born into a life where getting there never meant worrying about bus passes or whether the hotel near campus was safe. He didn't say any of that. Instead, he asked, "What do you want to be?" "A doctor," the boy said without hesitation. "A pediatrician." "Kids don't lie. They just tell you how they feel." The man smiled faintly. "Yeah, they do." They stood there a little longer, the hum of the airport wrapping around them. Then the boy checked his watch, a cheap digital one with a cracked face, and said, "I should go. Don't want to be late for check-in." "Wait," the man said, surprising himself. "Let me help." The boy looked at him wary now. Not suspicious exactly, but cautious, the way someone learns to be when offers of help often come with strings. "I don't need," he started. "It's not charity." The man cut in gently. "It's logistics. You've got an interview tomorrow. You should be thinking about your answers, not how to get across town with a heavy bag." "Let me call a car for you." Just this once, the boy hesitated. Then slowly he nodded. "Okay, thank you." The ride to the guest house arranged by the school was quiet. The baby slept the whole way, nestled in a carrier on the front seat. The boy sat in the back, staring out the window at the city lights, but his shoulders were less tense now. The man sat beside him, not talking much, just letting the moment breathe. At the curb, the boy gathered his things. "I'll pay you back," he said. "You won't." the man replied, not unkindly. But you'll pay it forward. That's how it works. The boy looked at him for a long time, then gave a small, real smile, the first one the man had seen. Yeah, he said. I will. They exchanged numbers, just in case, the man said. Just in case you need directions or a question about the interview or anything. The boy agreed, though he didn't seem to believe he'd actually use it. The next morning, the man couldn't stop thinking about him. He took his son for a walk in the hotel garden, pushing the stroller slowly under the morning sun. He'd built empires, negotiated billion-dollar deals, spoken on stages to thousands, but nothing had moved him like that quiet hum on the plane. It wasn't about the gesture itself. It was about the choice. The boy could have stayed in his seat. He could have pretended not to notice, but he didn't. He saw a need and he stepped into it without being asked, without expecting anything back. Later that day, the man called the academy's admissions office, not to pull strings, not to demand special treatment, but to ask a simple question. If a student gets in but can't afford to attend, what happens? The answer was careful, polite. Scholarships were limited. Competition was fierce. Financial aid covered only so much. He hung up and stared out the window. Then he picked up the phone again, this time to his assistant. Set up a fund, he said. Not public. Not named after me, just for students like him. Full ride, housing, books, a small living stipend for their families if needed. Start with one. See how it goes. He didn't mention the boy by name. He didn't have to. They both knew who he meant. A week passed. The man returned home, settled back into his routine. Meetings, calls, bedtime stories. But he kept the boy's number in his phone untouched. He told himself he wouldn't interfere. That it wasn't his place. Then one evening a text came through. Got in. Just 2 words. No exclamation mark, no emoji. But the man read them 3 times, then smiled so wide his son looked up from his blocks and giggled. He typed back. Congratulations. What's next? The reply came quickly. Mom's crying. I'm packing. Over the next few weeks, they exchanged a few more messages about dorm rules, about what to bring, about how scary it felt to leave home. The man never offered money outright. But when the boy mentioned his mom was worried about winter coats, a package arrived at their apartment with 2 high-quality coats, one adult, one teen-sized, no return address. When the boy texted that his old laptop had crashed, a new one appeared at the school office with a note. For your studies. A friend. He never signed his name. He didn't want the boy to feel indebted. He just wanted him to feel supported. The first semester was hard. The boy called once, late at night, voice thick with exhaustion. I don't think I belong here, he admitted. Everyone talks about summers in Europe or internships their uncles got them. I barely knew what a syllabus was. The man didn't offer empty reassurance. He said, you belong because you earned it. And because you care more than most of them ever will. That seemed to help. By spring, the texts became less frequent but brighter. Joined the pre-med club, tutoring kids downtown. Professor said my paper was exceptional. The man saved every message. Not because he needed to, but because they reminded him of something he'd almost forgotten. That brilliance isn't born in boardrooms or private schools. Sometimes it grows in cramped apartments, watered by sacrifice and sung to sleep with lullabies in forgotten tongues. Years later, long after the flight, long after the interview, the man would take his son, now a curious, bright-eyed 5-year-old, to a children's hospital for a routine checkup. They sat in the waiting room flipping through picture books when the boy looked up suddenly. Dad, he whispered. Isn't that him? The man followed his gaze. Across the room, near the reception desk, stood a young man in a white coat, kneeling beside a crying toddler whose mother looked near tears herself. He was humming softly, holding the child's hand, speaking in a calm, steady voice. And though he was older now, taller, more confident, the same quiet strength was there. The same kindness in his eyes. The man didn't interrupt. He just watched as the young doctor, because that's what he was now, gently coaxed the toddler into calm, then handed the mother a pamphlet with a reassuring smile. After the appointment, the man approached. You don't remember me, he said. The young man turned and his eyes widened. Then he smiled, slow and sure. Of course I do. You were on a plane with a screaming baby, and you were the one who made him stop. They stood there, 2 lives that had brushed against each other in the sky, and somehow stayed connected. The man introduced his son, who stared up at the doctor with wide-eyed admiration. Later, over coffee in the hospital cafeteria, they talked. The young man spoke about med school, about working nights to help his mom retire, about how he volunteered at shelters on weekends. "I never forgot that flight," he said. "Not just because of what happened, but because you saw me. Not as a kid from the wrong side of town, just as someone who could help." The man nodded. "You changed something in me that day. Made me realize that real wealth isn't in bank accounts. It's in moments like that when we choose to reach across the space between us." They didn't make big promises, didn't plan grand collaborations. They just sat, two men from different worlds sharing a quiet understanding. As they left, the young man knelt again, this time to say goodbye to the 5-year-old. "You take care of your dad," he said with a wink. The boy nodded solemnly. "I will." And as they walked out into the afternoon sun, the man realized something. The story hadn't ended on that plane. It had only just begun, because kindness once given doesn't disappear. It ripples, it echoes. It finds its way back, sometimes in a hospital hallway, sometimes in the eyes of a child who's learned, without being told, that everyone deserves to feel safe, and that, more than any fortune, was the real legacy. The hospital hallway smelled like antiseptic and old coffee, the kind of scent that clings to places where people wait, sometimes for good news, sometimes for miracles, often just for someone to say, "It's going to be okay." The young doctor walked it like he belonged there, because now, after years of proving himself, he finally did. His white coat wasn't just fabric anymore. It was armor, earned through sleepless nights, failed exams, moments of doubt so deep he'd almost walked away. But he hadn't, and today, like most days, he carried that quiet pride not in his posture, but in the way he slowed his steps when he passed a child crying in a parent's arms. He'd just finished rounds in the pediatric wing when he saw them. The man from the plane, older now, hair more silver than black, holding the hand of a boy who couldn't have been more than 5 or 6. The child was chattering about dinosaurs, eyes bright, voice full of the kind of joy that only comes when you're too young to know the world can be heavy. The man listened with the kind of attention most adults reserve for business deals, not bedtime stories. He nodded at the right moments, asked follow-up questions, laughed softly when the boy mimicked a T-Rex roar right there in the waiting area. The young doctor stopped, not because he was surprised to see them. He'd known this moment might come someday, but because it hit him all at once. Time wasn't just passing. It was folding in on itself, connecting dots he hadn't even realized were part of the same picture. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle them. "Hey," he said, voice warm. The man looked up and recognition flickered in his eyes like a light turning on. "You," he said, smiling. "I wasn't sure you'd remember us." "Hard to forget the baby who screamed like the sky was falling," the young doctor replied, crouching slightly to be at the boy's level. "How are you, champ?" The boy studied him with the serious curiosity only children possess. "Are you a real doctor?" he asked. "As real as they come," came the answer, delivered with a wink. The man watched the exchange, something soft settling in his chest. This was more than coincidence. It was continuity. The boy who once calmed his infant son with a lullaby was now the man helping other children feel safe in a place that often scared them most. They ended up sitting together in the sunlit corner of the waiting room, away from the bustle. The appointment was just a routine checkup, vaccines, growth charts, the usual, but neither of them seemed in a hurry to leave. The conversation drifted easily, like old friends catching up, even though they'd only shared one real moment years ago, high above the clouds. "You know," the man said after a while, stirring his paper cup of hospital coffee, "I started a foundation after that flight. Small at first, just enough to cover one student's tuition. Now it supports over 30 kids a year." The young doctor nodded. "I heard. One of my classmates got in through your program. She told me how it changed everything for her family." "I didn't do it for thanks," the man said quickly. "I did it because I finally understood something. Money can open doors, sure, but it can't teach you how to walk through them with your head up. That part? That comes from people like you." The young doctor looked down at his hands that had held newborns, stitched wounds, held the hands of scared parents. "I didn't do anything special on that plane," he said quietly. "I just did what I knew." "But you chose to do it," the man replied. That's the part most people miss. You saw a need, and instead of looking away, you stepped in. That's rare. Silence settled between them, comfortable this time. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past. Inside, a nurse called a name over the intercom. Life went on. But in that little corner, something deeper was happening. A passing of the torch, not with fanfare, but with presence. Later, as they stood to leave, the young doctor hesitated. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why didn't you ever tell me you were the one behind the fund?" "I found out by accident from a counselor. I don't know. I thought maybe you'd forgotten about me." The man's expression softened. "I didn't want you to feel like you owed me. What you did on that plane, it wasn't a transaction. It was human, and I didn't want money to turn it into something else. I wanted you to succeed because you were brilliant, not because I was watching." The young doctor swallowed. Then he nodded. "Thank you. For that and for everything else." They shook hands. Firm, respectful. But before they parted, the man placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're doing exactly what you were meant to do," he said. "Don't ever doubt that." That night, the young doctor didn't go straight home. Instead, he took the long way through the city, past streetlights and late-night food carts, his mind full of memories. He thought about the cramped apartment he'd grown up in, the nights his mother came home with tired eyes and sore feet, still managing to kiss his forehead before collapsing into bed. He thought about the scholarship interview, the way his palms had sweated, the way his voice had cracked on the first question, the way he'd almost walked out before the boy from first class had changed everything. He also thought about the toddler he'd comforted earlier that day, the one with the fever and the fear in her eyes. He'd hummed that same lullaby, the one his grandmother taught him, the one that had worked on the plane all those years ago, and just like then the child had calmed. Not because of medicine, not because of his degree, but because she felt seen, safe, human. It struck him then. Healing wasn't just about prescriptions and procedures. It was about connection, about showing up even when it wasn't your job, especially when it wasn't your job. Back at his apartment, he opened his laptop, not to check emails or study charts, but to write. He'd been asked to speak at a youth mentorship event next month, and he'd been putting it off, unsure what to say. Now he knew. He typed slowly at first, then faster, words pouring out like they'd been waiting for years to be spoken. You don't need to be rich to make a difference. You don't need a title, a platform, or permission. Sometimes all it takes is noticing someone who's struggling and choosing not to look away. He wrote about the flight, about the baby, about the man who could have ignored him but didn't. He didn't name names. He didn't ask for praise. He just told the truth, the messy, beautiful truth about how one small act of kindness can echo across a lifetime. When he finished, he leaned back, exhausted but full. Outside his window, the city hummed with its usual chaos, but inside there was peace. A few weeks later, he stood on a small stage in a community center, facing a room full of teenagers from neighborhoods not unlike the one he'd grown up in. Some looked bored. Some looked skeptical. A few looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. He didn't blame them. He'd been there too. He didn't start with a quote or a statistic. He started with a story. "I was once just a kid with a duffel bag and a bus pass," he said, "trying to get to an interview I wasn't sure I deserved. And on the way I saw someone who needed help. So I helped." He told them about the crying baby, the quiet hum, the nod across the cabin. He told them how that moment led to opportunities he never imagined, but also to a responsibility he couldn't ignore. "Success isn't just about where you end up," he said. "It's about who you bring with you. It's about remembering that your voice, your hands, your heart, they matter, even when you feel small." Afterward, a girl with braids and wary eyes approached him. "Did that really happen?" she asked. "It did," he said. "Would you have done it if you knew no one would ever thank you?" He smiled. "I did." She nodded like that answered something deep inside her. Then she turned and walked back to her friends, standing a little taller. That night, as he walked home, his phone buzzed. A text from the man: "Saw your talk online. You made your younger self proud." He typed back, "We both did." And in that simple exchange, the circle closed, not with a grand finale, but with quiet understanding. Because the truth was, neither of them had saved the other. They just reminded each other what it meant to be human. Years from now, someone else would be on a plane or in a hospital or on a bus feeling lost or overwhelmed. And someone else, maybe a kid with a worn backpack, maybe a stranger with tired eyes, would step in, not because they had to, but because they could, and the ripple would keep going. Not because of money. Not because of fame. But because deep down we all know what it feels like to need someone to see us, and sometimes all it takes is one person choosing to look. The rain started just after lunch, soft at first, then steady, drumming against the hospital windows like it had something urgent to say. Inside, the young doctor sat in the break room, sipping lukewarm tea and flipping through a medical journal he wasn't really reading. His mind was elsewhere. It had been a long week. Back-to-back shifts, a difficult diagnosis he'd had to deliver to a young family, and now this weather, gray and heavy, pressing down on the city like a sigh. He thought about calling his mother. She'd been quieter lately on their weekly calls. Not sad exactly, but tired in a way that worried him. He wanted to tell her about the talk he'd given, about the girl who'd asked if kindness still mattered in a world that often felt cold, but he held off. He didn't want to sound like he was bragging. And anyway, she already knew the kind of person he was trying to be. She'd raised him that way. His phone buzzed on the table. A message from the man. The one from the plane, the one whose baby he'd once soothed with a lullaby. Got your note about the outreach program. I'd like to help. Not just funding. I want to be part of it. The young doctor read it twice. He wasn't surprised exactly. Over the years, their connection had deepened in quiet ways. Text messages on birthdays. A coffee here and there. A shared glance at a charity gala neither of them really wanted to attend but went to anyway because they believed in the cause. But this felt different. This wasn't just support. It was partnership, he typed back. You sure? It's messy work. No press, no spotlight. A reply came almost instantly. That's why I want to do it. He smiled, of course. The man had changed, not in the flashy way people expected wealth to change someone, but in the quiet, steady way real growth happens. He'd stopped measuring success in exits and valuations and started counting it in moments. A student's first acceptance letter, a single mom finally able to quit her second job, a kid who looked in the mirror and saw possibility instead of limits. A few days later, they met at a small community center on the edge of the city, a place the young doctor had been volunteering at for months. It wasn't much to look at. Peeling paint, mismatched chairs, a kitchen that smelled faintly of burnt toast. But it was full of life. Kids doing homework at folding tables, teens practicing guitar in the corner, elders sharing stories over cups of strong coffee. This was where healing happened outside of hospitals, where loneliness was treated with conversation and fear with belonging. The man arrived in a plain sedan, no driver, no entourage. He wore a simple sweater and jeans, the kind of outfit he never would have considered 10 years ago. He walked in like he belonged, nodding at the kids who glanced up from their books, shaking hands with the center's director like they were old friends. You did this? He asked quietly, looking around. I help, the young doctor corrected, but it's theirs. They built this. They spent the afternoon talking to the staff, listening more than speaking. The man asked thoughtful questions, not about metrics or scalability, but about people. Who's struggling the most right now? What do the kids wish they had? What keeps you going on hard days? Later, over paper plates of donated pasta, they sat on the back steps, rain still falling in a gentle hush. I used to think giving money was enough, the man said, staring at the puddles forming in the cracked pavement. I'd write a check and feel like I'd done my part. But that flight, it showed me something. Real help isn't transactional. It's relational. The young doctor nodded. You can't fix someone's life from a distance. You have to sit with them in it. Exactly. The man turned to him. So I want to do more than fund your outreach program. I want to show up. Not as a donor. As a person. It wasn't a grand declaration. It was just truth spoken plainly. And it meant more than any endowment ever could. Over the next few months, he did exactly that. He came to the center every other Saturday, not to give speeches, but to do the work. Organizing book drives, helping teens with college applications, even learning to make decent coffee for the after-school crowd. He never mentioned his wealth, never dropped hints about his influence. He just showed up, listened, and lent his hands. The kids didn't care who he was. They cared that he remembered their names, that he asked about their little brothers, that he laughed at their jokes even when they weren't that funny. To them, he was just the guy who helps with math or the one who brought those cool science kits. But to the young doctor, it was proof that change doesn't always come from the top down. Sometimes it starts with one person choosing to kneel down to a child's level, literally and otherwise. One afternoon, as they packed up after a tutoring session, the man asked, "Do you ever think about that day on the plane?" "All the time," the young doctor admitted. Not because of what happened, but because of what it started. That moment. It was like a seed. And now look. He gestured around the room. At the kids laughing, the volunteers sorting supplies, the walls covered in drawings and thank you notes. "I never thought I'd be doing this," the man said. "I thought my legacy would be my company, my inventions. But now, I think it's this. The connections. The ripples." They stood in silence for a while, watching a group of kids build a tower out of recycled boxes. One of them knocked it over by accident and burst into tears. Without hesitation, another child, a girl no older than 7, wrapped her arms around her friend and whispered, "It's okay. We'll build it again." The man's eyes glistened. "She's doing what you did," he said softly. "Maybe," the young doctor replied. "Or maybe she's just being human." And that was the point, wasn't it? Kindness wasn't rare. It was just often drowned out by noise, by fear, by hurry, by the belief that someone else will step in. But when one person chooses to act, it gives others permission to do the same. Later that year, the outreach program expanded. With the man's quiet backing, funding matched by his time and attention, they opened a second location in another neighborhood. The young doctor hired 2 more part-time coordinators, both from the communities they served. They offered mental health check-ins, career mentoring, even weekend workshops for parents on navigating school systems and healthcare. It wasn't perfect. There were setbacks, funding gaps, staffing shortages, days when it felt like they were pouring water into a bucket with holes. But they kept going. Because every time they thought about quitting, they'd remember a moment. A teen getting their first job interview. A grandmother learning to read so she could help with her grandkids' homework. A boy who used to act out now volunteering to read to younger kids. These weren't headline moments. They wouldn't go viral, but they were real, and they mattered. One evening, after a long day at the new center, the young doctor found a letter in his mailbox. It was handwritten on lined notebook paper from a student he'd mentored the previous year. "You told me once that my voice matters. I didn't believe you then. But last week I spoke at a school board meeting about adding more counselors, and they listened. Thank you for seeing me before I could see myself." He folded the letter carefully and put it in his desk drawer, the same one that held the acceptance letter from the academy, the first paycheck he'd given his mom, and a faded photo of him and his little sister, taken on the day he left for college. He thought about calling the man, but decided against it. Some things didn't need to be said out loud. They just needed to be lived. As the seasons turned, their work deepened. The man began inviting other successful people, not for photo ops, but for honest conversations about responsibility, privilege, and what it really means to give back. Some listened, some didn't, but a few stayed, rolled up their sleeves, and started their own small acts of repair in their corners of the world. The young doctor, meanwhile, kept seeing patients by day and volunteering by night. He never stopped being a healer, just expanded what that word meant. Healing wasn't only about curing illness, it was about restoring dignity, building trust, making space for people to breathe, and through it all the memory of that flight remained, not as a story to tell, but as a compass. Whenever he felt overwhelmed, he'd remember the weight of that baby's hand in his, the silence that followed the crying, the way one small act had opened a door neither of them knew was there. Now, years later, he was the one holding the door open for others. One rainy afternoon, much like the one that started this chapter, he saw a new volunteer, a teenager, nervous and eager, trying to comfort a scared child who'd just scraped his knee. The teen fumbled at first, unsure what to say. Then slowly, he began to hum. The young doctor recognized the tune instantly. He didn't interrupt. He just watched as the child's tears slowed, then stopped. As the teen's shoulders relaxed, as another ripple began, and in that moment he knew the work would never be done. But it would always be worth it, because kindness once planted doesn't just grow, it multiplies, and the world needs every single sprout.